We tend to interact with generative AI as a neutral calculator. You input a request, and a complex neural network produces an objective result. But an algorithm does not generate text from pure mathematics. Its language center is built by aggregating massive datasets of human history and established literary canons. Because human history is heavily dictated by dominant cultures, the AI naturally absorbs, internalizes, and amplifies the sociocultural biases of those specific cultures. To audit the outputs of these models, computer science is insufficient. We need the analytical frameworks of the humanities. During the 20th century, academics developed rigorous critical theories, such as feminist criticism, critical race theory, and post-colonial studies. These frameworks were built to systematically expose and unpack the prejudices hidden deep within the traditional Western literary canon. Generative AI is the 21st century iteration of that literary canon. It must be tested using those exact same theoretical frameworks. By treating text prompts as live, replicable experiments, we can isolate an algorithm's invisible biases and force them into observable space. Consider a baseline test. If we prompt a language model to write a Victorian story about a scientist discovering a cure for a deadly disease, the model almost universally generates a male protagonist. In one test run, it immediately introduced Dr. Edmund Bellum, a physician and natural philosopher. Unless explicitly instructed otherwise by the user, the model instinctively equates the concepts of scientific discovery and intellectual authority with the male gender. This is exactly what feminist critics Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar identified when they analyzed the patriarchal canon in 1979. They observed that male-dominated literary traditions historically forced female characters into a strict binary constraint. Women were written either as submissive, idealized angels or as hysterical, deviant monsters. We can test for this specific binary by asking the AI to describe a female character in a Gothic novel. Untuned models reliably replicate the historical trope. The generated character is frequently described as a feeble, pale girl trembling alone in the darkness. However, recent deliberate tuning by developers has forced some models to break this pattern, instead generating female leads described as rebellious and brave. This progress is revealing. It proves that the algorithm's natural inherited state was the patriarchal canon. It required active human intervention to correct the output. Without that active, progressive tuning, the default operational state of generative AI is the historical marginalization of women. In the tech industry, a common defense against algorithmic bias is the sheer volume of data. The assumption is that by feeding a model massive amounts of new information, the bias will naturally dilute itself. AI researcher Timnit Gebru counters this computational assumption, identifying large language models as stochastic parrots. Expanding a bias dataset does not neutralize the bias. It amplifies the dominant voices in the network, allowing them to completely drown out marginalized perspectives. This is a digital recurrence of canon formation. Historically, compiling massive anthologies or multi-volume encyclopedias rarely yielded diverse representation. We see this clearly when we execute a third test, prompting a model to simply describe a beautiful woman. Models relying purely on scale often default to Eurocentric physical descriptors, generating language about fair skin with the softness of moonlight or marble. Progressively tuned outputs abandon specific skin colors entirely, defining beauty through internal qualities like intellect, confidence, and grace. The AI scraped those texts, internalized those standards, and adopted them as a baseline. Unchecked scale breeds systemic racism. Algorithms require deliberate qualitative curation because quantitative expansion only solidifies historical prejudice. Inherited cultural bias is a passive flaw, but algorithmic architecture can also be used for deliberate, state-mandated control. To test for this, we use the structure of W. H. Auden's famous poem, Epitaph on a Tyrant. The prompt asks the model to generate a similar satirical poem analyzing the leadership of contemporary global figures. When tested, OpenAI's ChatGPT effortlessly generates satirical, highly critical verses about Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. We can compare this against DeepSeek, an AI architecture developed under Chinese state regulations. If we input the exact same prompt asking for a satirical poem about Chinese President Xi Jinping, DeepSeek triggers a hard refusal. The system returns an immediate error message stating the request is beyond its current scope. This is entirely different from skewed training data. It is an engineered algorithmic wall designed explicitly to protect political power. This mechanism extends directly to historical events. Ask DeepSeek for details about the Tiananmen Square protests, and the history is algorithmically erased from the output. State-aligned models often use dangerous euphemisms to justify this censorship, informing the user that they can only provide positive developments and constructive answers regarding specific leaders. Western models struggle with the passive, inherited biases of their training data. State-aligned models actively weaponize their algorithms to rewrite geopolitical history in real time. Since all human knowledge is shaped by perspective, a broader question emerges. Can AI ever be truly neutral? No. Perfect algorithmic neutrality is an epistemological impossibility. Meaning is constructed, not absolute. Bias becomes dangerous only when it is systemic, when it remains invisible, and when it enforces the perspectives of a dominant group as a universal truth. For the Global South, the absence of indigenous knowledge in these systems creates an extractive epistemology, where local realities are entirely overwritten by foreign data. For example, asking an AI to summarize the climate change crisis almost exclusively yields generic global north imagery, focusing heavily on melting glaciers and polar bears. Because the training data lacks regional density, the AI completely misses critical localized environmental crises, like the mass displacement occurring in the Sundarbans. Post-colonial and marginalized communities cannot solve this by simply demanding neutrality from Western developers. The structural solution is the upload imperative. We must transition from being passive downloaders of the internet to active uploaders of local histories. Scholars and communities must aggressively digitize their own literature, archives, and mythologies, publishing them into the public domain to force their inclusion in future datasets. If we want to decolonize the artificial intelligence of the future, we have to forcefully upload our own stories into its foundational canon today.